Today is September 6th, 2024, and this is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, which works to preserve and promote classical Catholic education. If you're interested in learning about classical studies or philosophy, scholastic theology, and so on, you can join us in the Academy. It's open to students of all ages, and you can check it out at classicalliberalarts.com. Recently, as we're getting ready for a new school year, my wife, who spends most of her day chatting and emailing and talking on the phone with other Christian mothers, has been talking to me quite a bit about Catholic parents having a difficult time educating their children at home, struggling with their children not embracing their studies, resisting the efforts of their parents to promote Catholic faith and life at home, and so on. Just parents getting upset, getting frustrated, feeling like they just can't do it. They just can't succeed, and so on. And to be honest, when I hear these stories from Catholic families, I just laugh at the stories. I laugh at the stories for one very simple reason. We take ourselves too seriously. We take ourselves too seriously. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful or careless way. I mean it in a serious way. We take ourselves too seriously. And sometimes my wife and I, we've been together since we were 17 years old. Sometimes my wife and I will be stressed out or argue about something. We'll be frustrated by something going on. She'll be angry at one of the kids, and I'll be annoyed that she's angry, and you've just got all this tension and frustration and complaining and this and that. And sometimes we just sort of push back from the table and look at each other and think, what in the world are we even talking about? How in the world did we even end up in this situation? And when we start thinking about who we were, what our life has been like for the past 32 years together, what we've done, what we've seen, what we're doing, what we want to do, what we continue to work on, and so on, we can only laugh at how ridiculous we must look to God. We must really look ridiculous. And I think that there's something very serious that needs to be said about taking ourselves too seriously. Taking ourselves too seriously. Taking ourselves too seriously is a serious problem. And I'd like to talk about this a little bit, because I don't mean this in any sort of silly or irreverent way. I mean this in a serious way. We take ourselves too seriously, and that causes us to do really stupid things. It causes us to sin. It causes us to screw up our relationships, to make terrible decisions, and to live with a stress and attitude that just is not reasonable in the Christian life. We lose touch with reality, and we need to get our feet back on the ground. And if we could do so, I think we'd be a lot happier, first of all, a lot more thankful, and we would be able to do something that's very important, which is set realistic expectations. And so I'd like to talk about all of these things. While it seems to be a hot topic among parents my wife is talking to, and I think that my wife and I have enjoyed a happy marriage and a relatively fruitful Christian life, because this is one thing that I think we've managed to do well, because not I'm not saying that we've done anything good ourselves, but because we met when we were only 17 years old, and we can look at each other and just laugh at each other. So I'd like to share some of my story and some of my marriage story, if I may, because I think that you'll likely have, or some of you, many of you may have some things in common with us, and you can think the same way about them that we do. As I said, my wife and I met when we were 17 years old. I was the class clown of my high school in a town I grew up in. My parents went to the same high school I went to. Our family was established in the town I lived in. My dad was an electrician. My mother worked in accounting for Maybelline. And my two sisters and I went to public school. I was the class clown in a high school of almost 2,000 kids. Big public high school, Central New Jersey. And so my wife moved into my town when we were seniors. And it was one of the first few days of the year, my senior year, when I was sitting in a high school English class, and this cute girl walked in, a new girl, new student. And I noticed her, thought she was cute. First thing I noticed was she had nice running shoes on. I was an athlete in high school, and so I appreciated the running shoes. But I was more concerned with entertaining my friends and putting on a good show. And so I, just used to pick on my teachers and joke with my teachers and joke with all my friends. And I got away with all kinds of troublemaking because I was actually funny. And my teachers used to laugh and enjoy my goofing around. In fact, one of my teachers said that I was allowed to goof around as long as I made her laugh. And if I did anything that wasn't funny, then she would punish me. So I was the class clown, always fooling around. My friends were a bunch of wackos who I had been with my whole life. I lived in a working class town in Central New Jersey, where I was graduating from high school with kids I went to preschool with. And again, I had teachers in high school who taught my parents when they were in high school. So it was a very unique experience growing up. I was a very comfortable kid in a very comfortable environment, and really didn't know what I was doing in school, but I had a good time. And it was in that context that my future wife met me as the class clown in high school. And so she settled into my senior year English class and sat next to one of my best friends. And she got to sit there and watch us goof around like idiots all day long. And as I said, I was interested in her because she was cute and had nice running shoes on. So I saw the girls that she was becoming friends with as she settled into the school, and I pulled some of those girls aside and made good use of my connections to get in touch with her, and we started talking and started dating, and it didn't take very long before we realized that we really liked each other. And both of us were from strong families where we were raised in families where our parents were married, our uncles and aunts were married, grandparents were married. There were no divorces or anything like that. And we were looking forward to getting married. So even though we were 17, 18, we weren't really interested in dating. We were interested in finding someone to marry, both of us. But I was a total goofball. Total goofball. And I was a Central Jersey kid, so I was the foul-mouthed Jersey kid, and my future wife, Dania, was from an evangelical family and was a relatively good girl, a good student, good family. And so she got to meet me at my most ridiculous. She got to meet me when I was in high school just living like an idiot. But I was entertaining, and that was how our relationship began. I was the entertaining class clown, and she was this cute new girl in what I considered my school. And we got together, started dating, and began our life together. And we had all kinds of funny experiences because I was just so crude and ridiculous. And she invited me to go to church with her. And bringing me to church was like, I didn't belong in church. Let me just put it that way. And so I went to church, and her desire was to convert me to Christianity. And so she brought me to church and was introducing me to some of the guys at her church, guys our age, some college students, things like that. And I remember saying to her, like, I'm not going to become friends with some dork just because he's a Christian. That was how I thought. I was just so foolish and ridiculous, like I said. And I had no interest in the Christian culture, the evangelical culture, but I found out that the church had a baseball team that played games together over the summer, and I said, oh, cool. So I got involved on the church baseball team. I thought it was cool that it wasn't some old man softball team. It was baseball. And so I started playing baseball, started to make some friends who were Christians, first Christians that I ever had any relationship with, talking to and things like that. But I was still a goofball, going to college, going to parties, going out with my friends, going to clubs, drinking, just acting like an idiot, having fun. 19 years old. And then what happened was I had a serious conversion experience where I was just out fooling around as usual, and the verse where Jesus says, "Depart from me, you cursed, into eternal fire," was in my head. That verse was in my head while I was in a club with my lifelong friends in a college town having fun. That verse was in my head the whole night. And as I said before, I graduated high school and continued to be friends in college with kids I went to preschool and kindergarten with, kids I played pee-wee baseball with. And that night, when I had those thoughts, that was the last night I ever saw any of those friends. It was the night of my conversion. And that was in 1994, 1995, probably 1994. I was 18, 19 years old. So I went from being a class clown, goofball, sort of the life of the party moron, to all of a sudden I was a serious-minded Christian, and it was a change that happened overnight. And one of the most remarkable facts or experiences of my conversion was that when I converted, all of my foul language went away. Like overnight. I just didn't talk like that anymore. I didn't think about it, didn't try to change how I talked. That whole spirit that was in me went away. The foolishness went away. The craziness went away. The foul mouth went away. And I was raised as a foul-mouthed Jersey kid by the women in my family, by my grandmother and my aunt. And I could tell you ridiculous stories about my family because my family was crazy. A lot of my class clown material came from my family. I literally lived in a family that was a circus, and I could just tell you stories endlessly about my childhood and family members. But I was taught to swear like a sailor by my grandmother, who used to teach me all kinds of funny, dirty drinking songs. She lived in our house, and it was our little secret. You know, she would teach me all these funny, foul-mouthed songs that she learned when she was a kid growing up in Jersey City. And I was just surrounded by funny, wacky people growing up with crazy, crazy life stories. My father owned race cars, so we were in the racing crowd and had all kinds of characters, race car drivers and mechanics and bikers and police officers and just about any kind of person you could imagine in town was in and out of our house all the time. The doors were never locked. The lights were always on. I never knew who was going to be in my house when I got home. Kids in the neighborhood, my mother just welcomed everyone. I would get up in the morning and go downstairs, and kids from the neighborhood would be sitting downstairs eating cereal in my dining room. That's just how my parents ran our house. It was just a very crazy family life, but it was happy, and we erred on the side of silliness and had endless fun. But when I became a Christian, my spirit instantly changed, and I suddenly felt uncomfortable around my family. I felt uncomfortable around my old friends. And in God's providence, my freshman roommate dropped out of school in the first semester, and I was left in an empty dorm room by myself. And I spent a whole year, my 19th year, I spent the whole year, and this is not an exaggeration, I spent the whole year reading the Bible. And as I said, I went from total maniac to a very serious Christian in a very short period of time. Now that sounds like a nice story. That sounds like something wonderful. You know, God be praised, and I thank Him because it was a miracle, just how things worked out in my life at that time. I was saved from so much evil, so much potential harm, and then given a situation where I had nothing to do but sit and read the Bible for a whole year, the most important year of my life, my first year as an independent adult, as it were. But what happened was I became very serious as a Christian, and it was as if I forgot who I was. I was, as I said, not comfortable anymore with my family. I was not comfortable anymore around former friends. And as I was reading and meeting other Christians and learning about the Christian life, I decided that I wanted to be a serious Christian. I wanted to be a serious Christian. And in order to be a serious Christian, I had to act, because I really wasn't a serious Christian. I was a goofball who had been converted to believe in the gospel. All of the foolishness, all of the craziness that was in me as a kid was still in me. To this day, the same brain that was in my head when I was the class clown my senior year, that brain is still in me today. And I think if there's one virtue that I deserve some credit for, it's my ability to keep things inside that my brain suggests to me. And I've got a 24-hour-a-day comedy show going on in my head, and I've got to keep my lips closed and resist the temptation to share the craziness that's inside me. And so to this day, it's as much as I may appear serious to people who don't know me, people who assume all kinds of things about my background in life. We get comments from people all the time who say things like, well, Mr. Michael, I didn't have the privilege of enjoying a classical education like you did. And my wife and I just laugh because I had no classical education. I was a crazy public school kid. I didn't have a classical education. My education started after my Christian conversion, and it's a crazy story in itself. I had no Christian education. I grew up in the garage with my uncles. I grew up at family parties. I grew up hanging out with crazy friends in the streets of central New Jersey. I didn't have a Christian upbringing. I didn't have Christian parents. I didn't have Christian education, didn't go to a Christian school, didn't study anything. But I was smart, I was intelligent, I was cunning and silly. But I had no education until after my conversion, which I think was probably a blessing because I didn't have any confusion when I started to study at age 20 or so. But I had no education. I grew up in the most ridiculous circumstances, and I wish that people in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, people that I go to church with, people that I work with, people who hear me talk or read things I write, I think it would be good if they knew who I was, because I think it would allow them to let their guard down and allow us to talk honestly, not so we can glory in foolishness, but so that we could actually act reasonably and be who we are and actually make progress together, rather than trying to act like something that we're not. And I feel that for many Christians, especially when I get to know people, I feel like they try so hard to act like they're cradle Catholics who have been zealous from birth, rather than acting like the converted sinners that they actually are. And it's because our idea of Christianity is wrong. And the way that we think about Christianity and what we get wrong causes us to think that we need to be something that we're actually not. And it causes all kinds of problems in our life. And this is why I say we take ourselves too seriously, because we act as if God is like these other people in our life. And we act as if God doesn't know us. We act as if God doesn't know our past lives, our foolishness, our silliness, as if God doesn't know that I was the class clown of my high school, doesn't know all of the ridiculous things I did as a kid that my friends and I did. God knows all those things, and He loves me, and He's been good to me. And those things don't hinder my salvation. In fact, He saves me in spite of them. And I don't need to deny them. I don't need to hide them. I don't need to pretend that they're anything other than what they were, just sins of my youth, things that I did in times of ignorance. But what happens is when we become Christians, I think we think too much about our social life and social standing in the church. We think too much about our place in the church. We think too much about our relationships with other Christians in the church, our influence in the church, our visibility in the church, honor we receive from the church, and so on. And we try to act as something that we're not. We try to act like these polished, organized, established Christian people who don't have ridiculous things going through our minds 24/7. And I think that actually hinders our Christian life. It doesn't allow us to have fellowship. It doesn't allow us to celebrate our Christian life together. It doesn't allow us to laugh at ourselves. It doesn't allow us to be humble and happy because we're too busy acting, trying to pretend that we're something we're not. We try to pretend we're so serious when, like I said, there's Monty Python skits playing in our heads all day long. Now, the reason why I think that it's dangerous is because I think this is where hypocrisy really comes from. And if there's one thing that our Lord warned about, seriously warned about, it was hypocrisy. It was thinking of ourselves in ways that were not honest. St. Paul warns, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. And we tend to think that that means we should have some kind of morbid humility, that we should hate ourselves. When really, if we think about ourselves as who we really are, we can laugh at ourselves and realize that God doesn't need us. God isn't dependent. The Christian faith is not dependent. The church is not dependent on us being the most serious people in the world or having everything together. Think about what God says to St. Paul. He said, when St. Paul had a problem, and I'm not sure that I know what the actual problem was, but he mentioned having a thorn in the flesh. This problem, whatever it was, whether it was an actual physical problem he had, or whether it was a problem caused by some person who provoked him to anger or tempted him. I've heard a number of different explanations, not necessarily from Catholic sources, so I don't trust them. But he had this problem, and he prayed that God would take it away, as if his ministry couldn't be conducted or wouldn't be successful if he had this problem. And God said to him, no, actually, it's okay for this problem to remain because, and this is paraphrasing, of course, because I don't need you to be perfect. I don't need you to be trouble-free to carry out this ministry. In fact, in your weakness, my strength will be revealed. Your imperfections actually reveal my grace and make your message stronger, not weaker, but stronger. And you can see how in that message to Paul, God taught Paul to think of himself differently than we tend to think of ourselves as Christians. We tend to think that the salvation of our own kids, or the development of the church, or the restoration of Catholic life depends on us having everything perfect, having every I dotted, every T crossed, everything looking sharp, everything in order, everything perfect. And it doesn't. It doesn't depend on us. It never depends on us. We have a part to play. We're an instrument that God uses, but ultimately the work is achieved by God's grace, God's own wisdom and strength, and we're just an instrument. And some of the stories in Scripture are kind of silly if we think about them. And again, I don't mean to be irreverent, but they're funny stories. Like when Jesus asks St. Andrew to feed the 5,000. The story is ridiculous. You know, we can read it and try to pretend it's very serious, but the story is ridiculous. These disciples have left everything they had and followed Christ. They have no money. They're poor, like many of us are. They've sacrificed all kinds of things. They've lost all kinds of things to follow Jesus. And here they are, these poor disciples who've forsaken their lives to follow Jesus. And he turns to them and says, we need to feed all these people, 5,000 people. And St. Andrew hears this, and you can imagine the ridiculousness of this request. Okay, so I'm supposed to give up all my money, sell everything to the poor, follow you, and then you turn around and tell me to put everybody up for a feast. Like, it's just ridiculous. And the scriptures say Jesus said this to him knowing what he was about to do. It's like Jesus was pranking him, seeing how he would respond. And St. Andrew tries to talk seriously about it, like, oh, well, it would take like 200 days' wages to even provide a little bit for everybody. And what was the solution? The solution ended up being some bread and fish that a boy had who was present there. One of the disciples says, the whole story is kind of strange. One of the disciples says, look, here is a boy who has some bread and fish. And so they take the boy's bread and fish. And Jesus feeds the 5,000 with some food that it's taken from a boy. These men standing there, these disciples, who probably think that they're being prepared for some, great honorable office, are made dependent on a boy's lunch as the means by which this crowd of 5,000 people gets fed. And the story is ridiculous. And I don't mean that it's unbelievable. It's true, obviously. But the story is ridiculous in the sense that what Jesus asks of Andrew is perfectly consistent with who and what Andrew is. He's a poor man. I think he was a fisherman. He was Peter's brother, I believe. He's not a prince. He's not some wealthy man. He's a simple man, a working class man who decides to follow Jesus and risk losing all of his stuff. And Jesus turns to him and asks him to feed 5,000 people. Andrew's perplexed. He doesn't just confess and say, how am I supposed to feed anybody? I don't have any money. But he tries to figure it out like he's some kind of banker. And then Jesus ends up taking food from a little boy and feeding the whole crowd miraculously. And you just see how Andrew was given the opportunity to serve as an instrument in a work that God was going to do. And all he needed to do was sort of laugh at himself, laugh at the ridiculousness of the situation, and trust in God. And everything would have been done as it ultimately was done. That meal ended up costing Andrew not 200 days' wages. It ended up costing him nothing. And that's how the Christian life works. Again, in 1 Corinthians, St. Paul says something that I think is pretty funny. He's writing to the Corinthians, and he says to them, hey, look, and this is paraphrasing, of course. He says, look, you aren't the most impressive bunch, after all. Or really, we aren't the most impressive bunch. Not many of you are wise. Not many of you are noble. There aren't many impressive people there in the Corinthian church. But this is how God works. God chooses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. The weak things he chooses to defeat the strong. And we can read that, and we can read it with our serious spirit and say, yes, that's right. God chooses the foolish things to confound the wise. What a great teaching. But if we think about it from a personal perspective, Paul's writing to an audience and saying, look, you guys, aren't the coolest crowd of people in the world. You're not the most honorable bunch. We're really sort of a ragtag mob, like the Little Rascals, gathered together in the church. And we're in the church not because we've done any significant work or we've gained some great education or anything like that. We're in the church for one simple reason. It's because God was gracious to us and gave us faith. And he's gathered us together to be the instruments by which he destroys pride in the world. And so he intentionally chooses the misfits. If you watch Rudolph at Christmas time, you see the island of misfit toys. My kids always think that's hilarious. I always tease my kids and call them Hermie. But you see the island of misfit toys, and it's St. Paul basically teaches that that's what the church is like. The church is like the island of misfit toys. It's this band of people that God has chosen, not because they were good or because they're impressive or honorable or anything like that, but for the exact opposite reasons. He chooses them because they're not impressive people. He chooses them because they don't bring much to the table. They're like Andrew. They're challenged with the task, or they understand that the task of the church is like feeding 5,000 people, and yet they don't have a penny to their name. That's what it means to be a Christian. That's how the Christian church works. That's how God wills it. The church is filled with silly people. It's filled with people who are all kinds of screwed up. And we meet these people at church, we see them, we talk to them, we may look around and wonder where all these misfits have come from, where God finds these people and gathers them all into his church. And there's no community more diverse than the Catholic Church. And I don't mean that in some kind of respectable DEI employment way. I mean that in the fact that you literally have an island of misfits gathered together. And sometimes when we think wrongly, when we lose track of who we are, when we lose grip of what we are, where we came from, what the gospel is, what's actually happening in our lives by God's grace, we begin to think that we're impressive. We begin to think that what the church needs is for celebrities to become Christians. What we need is for the sports stars to become Christians, for wealthy people to become Christians. Catholics are especially bad with this. We need Mr. Bogardus from the Bells of St. Mary's. We need that rich guy with that big, huge building across the street to become a Christian and give us this big, beautiful, impressive building, because that's what God needs. That's what the church needs. That's what we need to influence our community. We need to be really impressive and show them how cool we are. Tell them that this pro athlete goes to our church. That's the kind of people we are. We're the cool, successful people. And the truth is, the church is the opposite. And what we see at church, the people we see at church, the people we're embarrassed by, the people we despise, the people who we think we're different from. We think that all the other people are misfits and that we're cool. We lose track of the reality that we're in the church because we're misfits too. And our conversion stories are as ridiculous as those of the disciples that we read about in the scriptures. Their stories are ridiculous. God chooses us because he's good, because he loves us, because he's strong, because he can do all things. And he intentionally chooses to defeat his arrogant enemies with a bunch of misfits. That's what the church is. That's how the gospel has advanced all through the ages, and it's how it is today. Now, what's funny is when we look at movies about the saints, or we look at storybooks about the saints, the saints are always illustrated or portrayed as beautiful, handsome, impressive people. They're always 6'2", handsome. Think of like the movie For the Life of Saint Anthony of Padua. Saint Anthony Saint Anthony is this handsome, masculine model. And we look at that and we say, oh, Saint Anthony's so great. Look how handsome and strong he is. He's got this beautiful, beautiful girl who loves him. That's what the saints are like. We can think of all the different saints and how they're portrayed as these beautiful women, handsome men. All the saint books have these muscular figures drawn in them. Jesus looks like a bodybuilder who long flowing hair like a model. And you see the pressure we put ourselves under. We put ourselves under this pressure as if Christians through history have been the beautiful people, the tall, the strong, the handsome people. And this really isn't true. If we think about biblical stories, we can find examples. For example, Joseph in the Old Testament seems to have been handsome. Samson was handsome. That didn't turn out too well for him. David is referred to as being ruddy in appearance, which I think we can assume means somewhat handsome, good-looking kid. But we also read about Saul, who was a foot taller than every other man, was the most impressive man in the city, and was appointed king because he was impressive. And we see in the person of Saul the idea that we have of what's needed in a leader. God needs the big, tall, handsome, strong guy to lead the people. And that's how we think. And it's all upside down, and God actually teaches us through Saul that the opposite is true. And when we actually learn about the saints, the more we learn about them, it's funny because I don't know if this has been your experience or not, but when you're unfamiliar with people, unfamiliar with a group, unfamiliar with an organization, you tend to have lofty thoughts about it. You think it's going to be really great. Everything's going to be cool. The people are going to be amazing. And then you get involved in the group and sort of become a member of the group and get to see things behind the scenes, and you realize that these people have all kinds of problems. The saints really aren't that impressive. You start learning more and more about their lives, and you realize that they had all kinds of bizarre idiosyncrasies and different problems, or they had physical problems like St. Alphonsus Liguori was hunched over. I think of St. Alphonsus Liguori as this big, strong, handsome, brilliant legal mind because I love him so much. And I probably wouldn't recognize him. If he walked past me on the street, I would probably never think that that's him. And I think that's really how Christians are. We're disappointed because we have hopes that our Christian friends are going to be the wealthy, handsome, respectable, cool people in town. And then we go to church and we find that the church is filled with people who don't fit that description, and we get frustrated like Christian culture is failing, and the church building's not nice enough, and the pastor's a little wacky, and the music isn't very good, and we think that these things are all going to undermine the gospel, when in fact these things are the gospel. This is the reality of the gospel. Our stories reveal not our greatness, not our excellence and success, not our worthiness, but they reveal God's goodness, God's kindness. And we can understand this very simply. When I was in college, I used to always spend a lot of time with kids because I had a sports background. I played every kind of sport. So when I would go to church, all the kids would love to hang out with me because I'd play basketball with them, throw a football around, goof around, and entertain them while their parents were talking and other things. I was sort of they actually called me the Pied Piper at the church I went to in college because the kids were always with me. Now, when we would play games, the kids would always want me to play against them and with them. And so we would choose teams. And so what would I do? I was a 22-year-old college student with a sports background. And these were a bunch of kids, a bunch of little church kids, maybe ages 8 to 12 or 14 at the most. So what would I do? I would pick the smallest, weakest kids to be on my team, and we'd play against the kids who thought that they were big and tough. And I would help the little kids win, and then we would celebrate, and the older kids would be angry and embarrassed and all that, because I would really play it up like they got beat by the little kids, by the weaker kids, and so on. And what was I doing there? I was choosing as my teammates the weaker kids, the kids who couldn't throw, couldn't catch, couldn't shoot, couldn't dribble, and so on. I was choosing them as my teammates because I wanted to humble the older, arrogant kids who wanted to brag and boast and talk trash and all this stuff. I wanted to humble them. I wanted to knock them down a little bit and make them become part of the group rather than boasting about themselves and separating the group or trying to put certain people out of the group. And so I would take the weakest, I would take the misfits as my teammates, and we'd beat the cool kids. That's pretty much what God is doing in the Christian church. God is taking the weak ones, the dumb ones, the silly ones, the backwards ones, the clumsy ones, the ugly ones, and he's taking them as his teammates and leading them to victory over the beautiful people, the people that are described, I think it's in Psalm 37 or 73, I get the numbers confused. But God leads the misfits like the Bad News Bears or like Karate Kid. He leads the underdogs to victory over the favorites for the benefit of everyone, for the humiliation of the favorites so they learn humility and become wise, and also for the joy and happiness of the misfits. And that's what God does, and that's what the church is. The church is not this Hall of Fame collection of the world's coolest and smartest and strongest and most handsome, beautiful people. It's what St. Paul says it is. It's a collection of people, not many wise, not many noble, not many impressive people, but it's this communion of people who have received grace and who love God because they know that God loved them when they were unlovable. And you can imagine the community is supposed to have that disposition. The community in the church is supposed to be a community of people where everyone is conscious of the reality that they don't belong there, that this place is too good for them, that these gifts that they receive are too good for them. Think about it. At Mass, we confess this. We say, I'm not worthy that you should enter under my roof. I'm not worthy to participate in these things. I'm not worthy to touch these things. I'm not worthy to be in a place like this. I'm not worthy to have all of these riches bestowed on me, all of these good things. And my life has been just an endless succession of good things. And these are the kinds of things my wife and I laugh about, that we enjoy so many amazing things, none of which we deserve. And yet, as I said, we forget that. We forget all of this. And we get lost in our acting. We get lost in our hypocrisy. We get lost in what really is a misunderstanding of the gospel. We get lost thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought, thinking that we've somehow merited a place at this table, thinking that God chose us because he was looking for, he was looking to draft a teammate and was looking for the best player left in the draft, we imagine that we must have been the best player on the board, rather than think that God was choosing for himself a team of misfits to lead to victory against his opponents. And that's why he chose us. Jesus, when he explained the nature of the church, he explained it as a drag net, where a fisherman throws a net and collects a bunch of fish and pulls them up on shore, and it's just a big mess of mixed up fish, all different kinds of fish caught in the net, and he drags them up on shore, and then he sorts them out. But he didn't compare the sorted out group as the church. He didn't say the kingdom of God is like when a fisherman pulls a net full of fish out and separates all the good ones. That's what the church is like. No, he said that the kingdom of God is like the net full of fish, all different kinds mixed together, that have been drawn out of the water, and they're going to be separated. That's none of our business. And in fact, we should be praying and hoping that we are actually the good ones. Jesus warns us and says, many who are first shall be last, and many who are last shall be first. He warns us. St. Paul also warns us. He says, and again, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have it memorized exactly. He said that we should all take heed if we think that we stand, lest we actually fall. If we think that we're strong, that may actually be because we are, in fact, weak and deceived about ourselves. Jesus tells us that when we've done everything asked of us, we should think of ourselves as unprofitable servants. And we read that and say, oh, that's what a great message in humility. No, it's ridiculous. He's telling us that we should think of ourselves as useless servants. Servants that bring no profit to the master. The master doesn't need us. He doesn't gain anything from us. Jesus tells his disciple, you are, and he clarifies, when you do everything you're supposed to do, you're just unprofitable servants. You don't actually contribute anything positive. You don't increase the master's wealth. You're unprofitable servants, and that's when you do what you're supposed to do, not normally when you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And so we can just see as we put these teachings together, as we put these passages together, we can see that when we walk around all serious, acting as if we're some kind of polished, all-together heroes of religion in the world, some great scholars who've got everything organized, we lose touch with the actual Christian faith. We lose touch with the gospel. We don't think of ourselves realistically. We act ridiculously because there's really nothing profitable about us. There's nothing really honorable about us. We're not wise. We're not strong. We don't bring God any benefit. The reason why we are in the church is because God loved us and continues to love us and called us out of the world, not as if we were the best available player in the draft, but just because he loved us and chose us freely and wanted to do good to us. He just wanted to do good to us. He wanted to share his happiness with people who he knew were not worthy of any such happiness, but it pleased him to share it and to choose us to be the recipients of that happiness. He doesn't ask much of us, but to be thankful. Socrates was a poor man, and he said, all I have to offer is praise. And that's true of us. We have nothing to offer him. Even if we do make any contributions financially, it's nothing. It's nothing that God needs. The church will go on just fine without it. And if we do offer anything, it's just a gift of gratitude, of thankfulness. Thankfulness for the opportunity to be called God's son, God's children. And that's the disposition we should have. And so we can see that there is some humor in the Christian life. There's some humor. And what comedy is, if we go back to ancient Greece and think about comedy, comedy is when something good happens in a story to a person who doesn't necessarily deserve it. Not a bad person, but a person who doesn't necessarily deserve it. And because if a good thing happens to a person who deserves it, that's just justice. That's not an enjoyable story necessarily, unless it's sort of this story of turning events, right, where a person goes through hardship and then receives his blessing in the end. But comedy simply just means that things go from bad to good. And so our Christian life is a comedy, like the Divine Comedy, where Dante moves from the inferno up to paradise. It's a comedy, the Christian life. When my wife and I joke about our life, I don't know if you've ever seen this, because again, you may not have been raised on cartoons as I was, and most of my knowledge of classical music and other moral lessons came from Looney Tunes and Woody Woodpecker. But there was one Bugs Bunny, it might have been Bugs Bunny, it might have been Wile E. Coyote, one cartoon where I think it was Bugs Bunny blindfolded, and he walks off a cliff. And as he walks off a cliff, like something swings under his foot and he steps on it, and it continues to happen until he's all the way across the chasm between these two cliffs. And then the blindfold comes off and he doesn't even know what happened. He just feels like he was walking. And we watch this ridiculous series of events take place. My wife and I often laugh because our life feels like that. Like we watch as things in our life happen, and things develop, and there are successes, and things come together in certain ways, and we sit back and we think, like, how in the world could these things happen to us? How can we be in this situation? Sometimes I go to bed at night and just lay in bed, and it sort of dawns on me that I'm teaching 1,000 kids the Christian faith. I've got students contacting me from all over the world, asking to help them with their studies, to help parents with parenting or teaching their children. And in my brain, when I think of myself rightly, I've still got Looney Tunes running through my head. I've still got 1990s grunge music playing in my head. I've still got funny stories and memories and events from times with my friends as a kid. I've still got ridiculous thoughts or comments or jokes coming to mind when I see people. Even in serious situations, my mind is the mind of a clown. And yet here I am, the owner of an accredited classical Catholic school program, and sometimes it just dawns on me how ridiculous all of this is. And I know that the parents would love for me to be an impressive person who has everything together and who has, this great education. They weren't able to get a great classical education like I was, and they really have no idea what the story is. And I expect that for most of you listening, I expect that the situation is similar. I bet that you're not what most people think you are, but you know yourself as what you actually are. You know your real history, your real background, your real relationships, and you know that it's true of you what St. Paul says of the Christians, that it's not many wise, not many noble, not the handsomest, not the strongest, not the best, but really God chooses the simple, the misfits. And he does so that by his own grace, for his own glory, he can use us as his instruments to confound the impressive people. And that's the dilemma. That's not the dilemma. That's the conflict that we see in modern culture, isn't it? It's sort of the arrogant, wealthy scorning the Christians, mocking the Christians because they're like a bunch of goofballs. And that's really what we are. We're like a bunch of penniless men being asked to feed crowds of thousands of people, and we don't even have food for ourselves. And yet we're put in positions to feed 5,000. You think of our priests. Many of our priests are clumsy, strange people, and we think, why would Jesus choose this guy to be the priest? And that's not us judging the priest. That's actually us being judged by our lack of understanding of the gospel, because it's actually exactly why Jesus would choose this man to be the priest. It's exactly why. It's exactly why he would choose this person to do this work and this person to do that work, because of the ridiculousness of it all. That's actually how his power is made perfect through weakness. And our faith, seeing this, knowing this, realizing this when we think rightly about ourselves and about others and about the gospel, that's what actually allows us to have our faith resting on God's strength and not on our own strength. And when we're in a disposition where we look at the church and think about God's strength and not the strength of the individual members of the church, not the beauty of the building, not the quality of the music, not the brilliance or the eloquence of the priest's homily, not of the impressiveness or the wealth or the education and culture of the people in the pews, but we look at it as a community of misfits who were lost and without God in the world, and who God chose to bring together as his family, as his household, and to give us eternal life, not because we deserve it or because we're worthy of it, but just because he's good. And that's what the church is. And realize how differently we would think about the church. Think about all the complaining and criticizing of the church today, and think of how ridiculous it is. Pope Francis especially annoys people who think wrongly, because he thinks rightly about himself. He thinks rightly about the church, and sort of laughs at the ridiculousness of his being chosen to be the Pope. And it's that ridiculousness that annoys people who think wrongly of the church and who think too highly of themselves. I mean, you have to sort of check yourself and realize that when you're criticizing the church and thinking that other people are unworthy, you're really out of touch with reality. And you're not the cool celebrity that you think you are. All those people in the church that you think are a bunch of weirdos and misfits and bizarros, you're there for a reason. You're one of them. And that's why I think we need to learn to laugh at ourselves when we lose sight of this and begin to take ourselves seriously, because as far as the gospel is concerned, as far as salvation is concerned, as far as any of the good things that we enjoy as Catholics are concerned, we're not worthy of these things. And the fact that we're allowed to handle them, the fact that we're allowed to share in them, it's ridiculous. It's laughable. It's comical to think of how serious, how infinitely precious these things are, and that God shares them with a bunch of misfits. That's really the beauty of the church, and it seems that we have a hard time embracing that because we're trying to act like something we've seen in a movie and not like real Christians. So I think if you struggle, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, if you struggle feeling like you're unworthy, St. Paul himself said, who is sufficient for these things? How in the world, St. Paul said, how in the world am I supposed to do this? How am I supposed to fulfill this ministry? And the answer was, by God's grace. Not looking to yourself or your own wisdom or your own understanding or your own strength, but simply being willing, like the boy who offered his bread and fish, being willing to participate and trusting in God's strength to carry out all the things that he's promised and to seek to take advantage of the opportunity to be an instrument that God uses, unworthy, undeserving, unpolished, unimpressive, an unprofitable servant, and realizing there's no pressure on us. The good things of the Catholic life don't depend on our having everything perfect, getting everything right, doing everything perfect, and so on. It's not dependent on our perfection. We simply need to preach the gospel. So even when we do fail, the gospel explains why it's not crazy for us to fail. And it keeps everything in balance and also doesn't allow others to be offended by our failures, because they need to understand too that our failures are the reason why Christ came into the world, and we will continue to stumble and make mistakes and even sin throughout our entire lives. And it's not good, but it also doesn't disqualify us. And so if you're struggling as a Christian and you feel like you're not sufficient, you feel like you're failing, I'd like to encourage you just to sit back and spend some time thinking of your life, of your history, of where you were, of how things developed in time, of all of the good things you enjoy, none of which you deserve. And think of the situation of your life where you are and how many good things you have to enjoy, and how ridiculous your stress and complaining and frustration, how ridiculous they are. As if you should be doing something more or deserve something greater than what you have, when the reality is that you already have far more than you deserve. And instead of being content and thankful and laughing at yourself, you're spending your time frustrated and angry at others, blaming others, miserable, and you're presenting that to the world as the face of one saved by grace. This fussy, complaining, critical, miserable wretch will turn around and talk about a religion where God loved the world and freely chose to save sinners at his own expense. And people will try to understand how what you're preaching can possibly be reconciled with this miserable puss on your face as you go through life complaining about things, fussing, stressed, The disconnect is undermining everything you do. And so I think the key, which, again, being with my wife since I was 17 years old and being forced to do this, the key is just being able to laugh and to know not to take myself too seriously. One of my favorite musicians, or one of my favorite music bands as a college kid was Oasis, a British band, British rock band. And the leader of that band, a man named Noel Gallagher, he was recently asked about his kids. Now that he's older, do his kids like his music? And he was like, no, my kids don't care. And he told this funny story about his wife. He said, my wife treats me, even though he's a multi-millionaire, one of the world's most famous musicians in one of the world's most famous rock bands. He said, my wife treats me like I'm an 11-year-old who just had his first guitar lesson. And his wife, in spite of all of this fame, all of this wealth, all of this success, which he doesn't take too seriously, his wife is there in his life, and she doesn't care about any of that stuff. She doesn't care about the fame or the money. She just looks at him like her husband. His kids look at him as their dad, and that's the effect that my relationship with my wife has on me. It doesn't matter what I achieve or what I do. I'm always going to have a woman living with me who, when she looks at me, sees 17-year-old moron who was a class clown in central New Jersey. And I think that's what keeps me from trouble. So anyway, I hope that you find this encouraging. One of these days I need to share some childhood stories because, like I said, my childhood was a circus, and I can share funny stories for hours. But think of where you've come from, who you really are, not the fake act, not the show you put on in public, but who you really are, where you come from, and the fact that God is choosing to save sinners, not the wise, not the strong, but the foolish and the weak, to accomplish his purpose. He's asking the penniless to feed 5,000 because he already knows what he's going to do. So be encouraged. Don't get overwhelmed. Turn and place your trust back in God where it belongs, and know that even if you do everything, you're still an unprofitable servant. And so there's really no pressure. God didn't choose you because he was in trouble and needed you to save him. He chose you because he's good and he wants to give you eternal life. And you can enjoy it. I hope that's helpful. God bless.